Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about indigenous religions. And now, there is no real way to characterize all indigenous religions as one big unit of religion. All right, it's that they're all different. They all have their own characteristics and their own flair and whatnot. You want to say they're not all the same, but for the most part, you can see where we have this ability to look at indigenous cultures and know, hey, these guys are indigenous. Well, what makes them indigenous other than their nativeness to the area or whatnot? And so we're gonna take a look at some of the characteristics that when we talk about indigenous religions in human geography, here's kind of what we're talking about. And a good way to do it is to look at Africa. Now I'm borrowing this off the internet, and we're looking a little bit at African indigenous religions. Is the thing with this is that it's very similar in other indigenous religions as well. For example, in the Aborigines in Australia or elsewhere. And so what are some of the characteristics of indigenous faiths? Well, for starters, let's define what indigenous means. It means originating or occurring naturally in a particular place. All right, and so native maybe is a synonym with the idea of indigenous. Okay, so if we're talking about an indigenous religion, we're talking about a religion that might be native to a certain geographic area, very important, and native to a certain group of people that kind of inhabit and always have inhabited that geographic area. Now, one important distinction is that I'm not saying that all natives or indigenous peoples originated in the area where we consider them to be indigenous. For example, the Aborigines apparently about 40,000 years ago moved across some kind of a land bridge, enabling them to reach Australia. All right, and so they wouldn't really be native to that land. So it's kind of, you just got to take it for what it is. All right. But traditionally, the people that are native or indigenous to those different regions where these religions prevail would be people that have been there for a very, very long time. So long, in fact, that in the late 1800s, many scholars of the West actually thought that maybe they were like living fossils of what ancient civilizations used to be from an anthropological point of view. Like fossils and tools and bones become fossils that tell us a little bit about what a group of people might have been like and what they might have used. In the same way, you could use these local indigenous tribes to kind of demonstrate how people might have lived thousands of years ago, because they are relatively isolated, they are relatively local, they don't really move a whole lot. And so many scholars use this as maybe as a way of figuring this out. I want to say that Jared Diamond made a video on it. He's the author of Guns, Germs, and Steel. He goes in there and looks at indigenous groups and tries to figure out a little bit about what people might have lived like prior to civilization. So that's kind of a common view. But looking at the word native, it can be associated with a negative connotation. I mean, today we live in a world of political correctness, right? Where we can't really say certain things because we might offend groups. Well, I would say the indigenous and native become offensive when we start saying that those people are primitive or not as good as maybe a more civilized or more civilized group, like a Western civilization kind of thing. All right, so that's where it might become very, very particularly offensive to people that would be indigenous. Now, I don't think that people that are Cherokee have a problem being Cherokee. I don't think people that have there are other types of maybe an Eskimo or an Aborigine. I'm pretty sure they'd probably be really, really proud of that. And so we had to kind of adjust our views in a more modern world. In fact, today many of these indigenous religions or indigenous peoples are in danger of losing out on some of that culture because of globalization. So today there's a great emphasis on preserving those local cultures and indigenous people and their culture. This here is a set of notes that I've taken. I've kind of listened to and then read various sources and everything. I'm trying to just come together with a short, concise set of notes that kind of is demonstrative of indigenous people and some of their similarities. Impossible to characterize them all together because they're so different. But for the most part, most indigenous religions don't typically have any kind of sacred texts or whatnot, like some of the great religions like Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Taoism or Buddhism or Hinduism. These are some of the more famous world religions because they're so widespread, because they're so large, if they're not widespread, because they're very, very influential. And so these are considered to be the great religions, but indigenous religions aren't like them. They don't have this spiritual book or sacred or known set founder. I know Hinduism doesn't really have a known founder. There are arguments about the founders of Taoism. Lao Tzu, it may have been founded long before him in some places, or some scholars say that. But nonetheless, you can't really trace back an origin to an indigenous religion. We've already seen in class by watching the TED Ed video about the origins of religion, how many of these earliest religious people studied or believed that there were spirits that kind of embodied our physical and our physical elements like stones or mountains or water or wind or whatnot. These things were imbued with spirits. All right, this is kind of the idea I've written down here at the bottom called animism. When things are imbued with spiritual power and perhaps there is some sort of a spiritual high God figure. Maybe all of these spirits are part of a greater spirit or a God figure, or maybe a mother creation type figure. Even though they might not really have the same stories about how people got here. Most of the time, though, you might say that perhaps these greater spirits or gods or whatnot may have created or in some way adjusted mankind to be the way it is today. And even though you've got this, I wrote down a high God spirit, okay, down here at the bottom. Most of the time, this central God idea will not be prevalent in day-to-day life among animists or shamanists or indigenous faiths at all. Most of the time, it might be lesser beings or lesser spirits that control the day in and the day out. Okay, so maybe perhaps if you worship this one god is a spirit is a god or spirit of luck, or maybe this other one might help you have a better hunt, or maybe this other one might help you to have children or whatnot. So they would pray to different gods depending on what their needs may have been, and they believed that gods may have dwelt in those types of things, right? In nature, for example. We already talked a little bit in class about how if we went back in time today, some of these most ancient indigenous groups would prove to you that the sun was a god, and that the sun god was going to make the sun rise in the morning and set in the evening. And the reason how he'd prove that to you is that you woke up in the morning and that's exactly what happened. The sun would rise and then it was set. Right? And so they believed in these guys because they believed that was the thing that was controlling the order of nature, and that it was kind of we're going to look at Taoism as this kind of yin and yang aspect, but for the most part there was this degree of natural balance due to these spirits. All right, and so it really does make kind of sense when you think about it. There's no languages written down. All right, we've already talked about how sometimes these people are called natives. Let's talk for a second about the geography. Geography is one of the most important elements of these indigenous groups, because their religions are based on their local geography, or at least is so heavily influenced by that it's impossible to ignore. For example, if they have an idea about how the world was created, they're going to have an idea about how the world was created based on the things that they know, based on legends and lore that were passed down in that geographic region having to do with that geography. And so you can see where geography would play a major, pivotal, critical role in the development of some of these indigenous faiths. Okay, today there's a lot of stereotypes about animists or about native or indigenous religions in general. Okay, we've already kind of mentioned this. For in some cases they may not be as native as they appear. They may have moved from one place to another. Most of the time they have geographic ties. We just talked about that. Okay, it's not always the case. Okay, some scholars in the past have called these religions primitive, and even today, whether you like it or not, we tend to either outright believe this, or we tend to at least maybe kind of subconsciously, as a society, you can still see where these things are depicted in, negatively, or I guess primitively. Right? You watch a movie. I was just watching a lecture where this guy was showing dances with wolves. Right? And you can kind of see from when we watch movies like this, we kind of not everyone, and I'm just saying that in a lot of cases though, from things that we've seen or our westernized depictions of Native Americans in particular, we tend to think of them as primitive because of the way we've portrayed them in some of our entertainment. All right, so scholars believe that as late as the 1800s, the indigenous people simply didn't progress, and nonetheless, then and today, they are somewhat symbolic of how ancient humans may have lived. Talked about that already. Most scholars today don't consider them less advanced or primitive. Rather, it is more seen as the development of their cultural preferences. We've talked about environmental determinism, and we've talked about possibilism. And so it's kind of improper to think today that these people are less than the West because of the way that they live their lives. Okay, and so I also want to talk with you real quick. I wrote it down here at the bottom just now. The idea of a shaman. I really had not mentioned this earlier in the video, or at least I hadn't talked about what shamanism is. But we're going to look at that real quick because there is a lot of that also in indigenous religions where a shaman or some kind of a holy priest kind of figure may actually be the human embodiment of a spirit, or maybe even just have a closer link or understanding of the spiritual realm. Googling shaman results in this definition: a person regarded as having access to and influence in the world of good and evil spirits, especially among some peoples of Northern Asia and North America. Typically, such people enter a trance state during a ritual and practice divination and healing. So just like the definition, times these shaman may be some kind of a link between the spiritual world and the world in which we live, and so because of that, they may have apprentices that they would train up to be the next shaman, but they tend to have a lot of power or prestige within their local tribes, and sometimes maybe some kind of a tribal leader. But yeah, again, this isn't independent of animism, or isn't independent of other indigenous faiths. Sometimes you see all these elements go hand in hand, and sometimes you don't. So there's just some of the main overarching ideals of the indigenous religions that we want to look at in epihuman geography. And starting to wrap it up, I wanted to look also at the idea of oral tradition. Many times, over a huge amount of time, there are these stories and their lore and their myths and their legends and all these different things that make up the basis of their indigenous faith. Actually, it's passed on through oral tradition, seeing as many times these groups are illiterate. They may not have a written language. They may not have a need for a written language, and so they don't have any other way of communicating their stories or their principal beliefs except through oral tradition, which may be another reason why there might be an importance on this shaman or leader figure. Another note that I want you guys to know is that oftentimes these indigenous groups are relatively small. They don't really grow all that much, or they're not expanding rapidly, like you may see other countries or whatnot. Their populations are just increasing like crazy. These guys are trying to survive in a world of globalization. I'm not going to say that there aren't groups that are increasing. I'm not going to say there aren't groups that are really large, because there are. So there's a group in Africa that's larger than there's more of them than there are Jews in the world. All right, but nonetheless, I'm looking at most cases, or overall, you're not going to see a whole lot of that. I don't want to spend too much more time on the video, but looking back at that source I showed you guys originally that I got off the internet, it looks like a PowerPoint presentation. Here to talk about how the indigenous religions, religion was not separate from everyday life, part of every action and event. And so the importance here is that these spirits of these indigenous faiths were what basically held everything together and made things come together and turn about. All right, and so that's one thing I wanted you guys to know. The issue of polytheism comes into play, because I just mentioned that some of them might figure into existence the idea of a higher being or a higher God figure, which kind of insinuates monotheism, but this is not what it was at all. That higher being may have the use of other lesser beings or lesser spirits that would be like an incarnation or a representation of that higher being in a different form. Okay, and so this is kind of hard for us Westerners to understand, but the polytheism in many cases kind of works out like that. They might everything has kind of a spirit energy kind of thing. And there's a lot of ancestor. Sometimes when you hear the word ancestor, you mean they mean literally ancestor spirit or worship or their ancestral spirits, but it also might mean like the ancestor spirits that helped to bring about creation. So you have to look at the word ancestor in several different ways when you're studying indigenous religions. But many of these were polytheistic with a major god, but many sub-deities is the best way to sum it up. Priests oversaw shrines and religious ceremonies and communicated with spirits, and these priests oftentimes, some of them were shamans like we just spoke about. The role of God. These characteristics are general, an all-powerful creator of humans and the world. I mean, I'm not gonna say this is a fact for animism. That probably I would probably say more like let's keep it with where we just now were. All right, I'm not even gonna worry so much about that slide. I want you guys to think about animism as kind of this mentality right here. All right.